I now have the pleasure of introducing Skye Berger, our speaker for this morning. So Skye is a leadership, lifestyle, and business coach and chief encouragement officer at Door Opener Academy. Her professional background includes child welfare, mental health, addictions, facilitation, and program development. Skye is a very sought-after expert in empowering youth and families while renewing the youth workers and organizations that serve them. Skye has reached international audiences through keynote presentations, online, and real-life training. Yes, we do have real-life training that we will get back to at some point. And with her books on renewal, teen parenting, and youth transitioning into adulthood. A Gary, Indiana native, she holds a Bachelor of Arts in both psychology and sociology from Purdue University and a Master of Science in organizational behavior with a concentration in executive coaching from the University of Texas. As a Six Sigma Green and Black Belt, Skye has applied quality management skills by focusing not only on policy and processes, but connecting workforces, heads, and hearts. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Skye Berger.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here. It's good to be a great company. Let me say that, well, from the bio, and for many of you just reading through the names of our attendees, I'm a Northwest Indiana native, so it's always just wonderful to be at home, right? Even at home. Well, today we are going to talk about a few things. We have roughly an hour and a little bit of change, really about an hour at this point, to get through some topics that are very near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about resilience, protective factors. When we consider historical trauma, we have to consider those things as well. Epigenetics, we'll have a brief conversation around that. The Black, Indigenous, people of color experience, but we are not going to leave out the Black and white binary at all. We're going to talk about how we apply this to our work, and then we'll wrap up with some questions. All right, so starting with resilience and protective factors and how we really connect this to our trauma. I don't know if many of you have seen this scale. I did give credit to the Center on the Developing Child from Harvard. I want to think that I live on their website. I technically just live there. There's not a video that I don't think that I've watched as we consider what's going on with our young people. I know that you had a presentation from my good friends, Robin and Jessica, a few days ago, where they were able to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And in considering the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, those experiences, whatever they are, adversity, however it comes, is going to have a negative impact on our young people. So considering those negative outcomes, those potential negative outcomes that can happen from those experiences, what we want to do is make sure that we have more positivity on the scale rather than not, right? Considering our children's experience and what they're going through, we always want to outweigh those negative things with the positive. Okay, so some more information from Harvard. When we think about resilience, when we think about the interactions with our children, when we think about the predispositions and what can happen as far as the path that they're on, we want to kind of take into consideration a few things. And now all of these are split up. Also, when we think about being able to manage threats to physical or social well-being is critical for the development of resilience. Having an extreme response to both negative and positive experiences is something that we want to look out for our young people. In addition to resilience being developed at any time, but the earlier, the better. When we consider development, I know that Robin went into a little bit of the brain science about what goes on with children as they're developing. We want to consider resilience as an early intervention factor, but that does not mean that we can't have resilience occur at any point in a young person's path. What I feel is though, when we consider resilience, we're really looking at those implications and how those protective factors really should, and that's a big SH, right? Really should influence our policy and practice as far as how we interact with our families, how we are interacting with our young people, how we are even interacting with our coworkers. I'm currently participating in a foundations course for youth work. And even just considering when we think about protective factors in policy, that our country is, one of the countries that still has not signed the referendum for protection for children. And when we think about that on a global scale and all of the things that we see practice and policy and our world at unrest right now, right? We sit right now in this country while we know that there's another country that is being ravaged, right? So as we consider our policies for children and what that means to really protect them in our practice, those are some things that we want to consider for protective factors as well. One of the great things about humanity and thinking about resilience, the easiest way to say it is that when we fall down, we have to get back up, right? So every time we fall, we want to consider that a falling forward. But what I like to say is really a failing forward. I can say that my outlook on life was heavily influenced from my background and my upbringing. There just seems to always be something going on. And with those things always going on, it seems like I was falling down a lot. So for every 7 times that I got up, there was probably some stumbles in between. And when we consider our young people that have experienced trauma, our young people and their families, they don't come in isolation, that are going through some of the very similar things, they have to always get back up again. I laid down that brief conversation because I know that it will go so fast, especially when we get into the question portion about historical trauma and the implications for that. Historical trauma, I want to make sure that we are not looking at this like with our blinders on, because when it comes to historical trauma, in the conversations that we are going to come up with in the next few moments, we are going to discuss some of the tragedies that have really occurred in our history. And now even with some legislation that is attempting to be passed, these things really occurred. And I want to make sure that we can highlight them as it pertains to the many populations that we serve. I now reside in the Indianapolis area where there's a heavy population of Burmese. So when we think about if you don't know the history of the Burmese population, is something that I encourage you to go and look into yourself just for your own knowledge and understanding, but just to consider all of the traumas that have really impacted our society, all of the traumas that have really impacted us going forward, and how that really relates to the child's adversity. This is a picture that we are going to sit with for a few moments. And like CNN disclaimer, some of these things are very graphic. And these are some pictures that we kind of just want to take in and sit with us for a while so we can understand that these are children, right? We have adults there, we have children in many of the pictures, but these are things that were allowed to happen in many countries and exclusively in our country. As a person of color in my home, I grew up with the Ebony Encyclopedia, and there were pictures of people of color that had been killed, that had been lynched. There are pictures from the Tulsa Massacre. It's also known as Black Wall Street. These are pictures that we were provided with, and they were pictures of death, and they were pictures of trauma. I don't know if you know, I knew that word trauma then, that I had to sit with. These are pictures that we were warned in certain parts of Indiana, you don't go by yourself. In certain parts of Indiana, you don't stop to get gas. In certain parts of Indiana, you need to be careful because this is what happens. And I am speaking from my experience, from my personal experience as a person of color, born in the 80s, actually 40 years ago today, it's my birthday, born in 1982. These were very real tragedies that were going on and very real warnings and promptings to take care of myself externally. So when we think about adversity, when we think about trauma, when we think about things, these are things that were allowed to happen. My colleague, Dr. Carlin Tishner, and I, when we put this presentation together and we contemplated this slide, it was during a time where our history, and I say our collective country history, was being debated as to whether or not it should be shared in school or not. And we decided to put many images and many examples of not just Black people, right? Not just Indigenous people, but of people with children that had been harmed and it had been allowed to be harmed. Prior to the conflict that is going on right now in Ukraine, I've always and often used the example of that everything Hitler did was legal in his country. So when it comes back to things like the referendum for the safety of children for the United Nations not being signed by our country, these are the images from my childhood that I go back to. In no way I've tried to lighten up, right? There's all light in my PowerPoint. It's all white background, so that to lighten up the fact that we can move from here. I am going to give an anecdotal remedy, right? And just take us to the end of the presentation and say that how do we stop tragedies like this from happening? I want to say we start with today, considering what has happened in our past, but know that this is our real reality. Categories of historical trauma, I'm kind of going to talk about them, and they happen in 3 phases. It's the mass trauma experience, first of all. Many of those pictures, we can see that was over time, right? We see men hanging from trees with children present in the audience there. We see children just with tattered clothes, with possibly malnutrition bodies. We see that experience was something that happened over time. And so Mr. Braveheart, in his work, really tells us about how the mass trauma experience occurs, and then what the trauma response is, and then what happens from that transmission from experiencing that historical trauma. So a trauma experience, it could be subjugated by many means. So when we think about military force, bio warfare, all those policies of genocide that have happened, ethnic cleansing, incarceration, and so forth. Trying to erase the culture of a people is what encompasses that trauma experience. So when we're thinking about that trauma experience, when we're thinking about things that people have gone through, it's not okay for us to say, okay, this didn't happen or that happened before, so let's move forward. What we know now about the brain is that all of those experiences, no matter how they were subjugated, are going to fall upon the bodies of human beings that carry them in different ways. And as we are considering their experience, as we are considering the trauma that they've gone through, as we're considering these things, we have to understand also that it's imprinted on generations of people that are experiencing this, and then really passing that trauma marker onto their families, onto their children, throughout their communities. So these things are being spread. When we think about the model of trauma and what's happening, and I do apologize for the heavy words on the screen, there is some overwhelming physical and psychological violence that occurs, segregation or displacement, economic deprivation, cultural disposition, right? Not being able to have access to things. And so with this trauma response, what Braveheart says is that the historical trauma response always includes heavy levels of substance abuse. If we think about even to this day, I was speaking with one of my friends whom has a Native American heritage, and she was speaking about in the 90s, right? This is the 1990s, that they were still busing children to boarding schools from their reservations. On some of the reservations, there still was not running water in all of the homes. They had to go to still a bathhouse to make those things happen. So when we think about substance abuse, suicide, depression, anxiety, self-esteem issues, right? These are all things that sound like adversity that Jessica handled a few days ago, if you were able to tune in for that discussion. The anger, difficulty in recognizing and expressing emotions, and really unresolved historical grief. So considering what happens to our bodies, considering what happens in our experience, it's never just the behavior. It's never, ever just the behavior. And Braveheart here illustrates what that trauma response usually is. So when it comes to the transmission, and we think about that second generation, that third generation, I have one of my daughters, last year, actually 2 years ago now, we're going into 2 years, my daughter has lupus. And so she was carrying my granddaughter, and because of her lupus, her body started to, what lupus does is an autoimmune disease. And so it actually attacks the body. The baby was not going to be able to make it. And so the doctors had to make a decision to save my daughter's life or to induce the pregnancy of my granddaughter. And when I think about this trauma transmission, I took full responsibility for everything that is going on in my daughter's body because she came from my body. But then when my granddaughter was born, I had this glow of realizing I gave my daughter my granddaughter, because when I was carrying my daughter, she also had those the mechanisms embodied in her body and her eggs to be able to have my grandbaby, right? And so even though my granddaughter is no longer with us, she passed on. When I think about that transmission, right? Just she came from my body, she came from my daughter's body. I use that as an illustration to think about that second generation, right? And for me, that third generation, my grandchild. But the things that are passed down, all the trauma that I may have been experiencing in my body was given to my daughter, and then also given to my granddaughter. When we consider the effectiveness, the affect of what happens with those emotional symptoms, the way that trauma is passed down, the chronic sorrow, right? All those things, inability to communicate feelings, all those things we talked about in the last slide, but also the overprotectiveness of the community that comes with trauma transmission is just another example of how we can illustrate this. And epigenetics is exactly where I am leading this conversation to. Epigenetics really is considered in every experience how things are turned on and turned off. I have just described as epigenetics things in my granddaughter being passed on from my daughter. We need to consider every experience as an opportunity to turn on or turn off the genes that would allow us to really move forward in a positive or negative way. And when I say us, I mean with our experience, believing that we are all connected to the young people and their families with whom we are engaged. That's really important, right? Because we want to make sure that we are not re-traumatizing children, making sure that we are that positive, connected adult. And I can say this out loud at this point, because I've been doing this long enough and I know that there are youth workers that run into families that they don't particularly like. And let me say that that's okay, because it becomes our responsibility then to make sure that we are connecting that family with someone who can like them, right? It's really that simple. So on this epigenetic slide, as we consider all of the possibilities that come up for experience, all the possibilities that come up for being able to work with other people. Epigenetics is really the key to making sure that we are clear on how our chemistry is working. What I can really appreciate is the fact that we continue to advance in science. We continue to advance in technology where we can have markers and see how it impacts group A, group B, right? So if my granddaughter was still with us, we can see how some of the markers would have been turned on and turned off in her body. And what I have realized now is that considering ACEs, I want to jump to this tree slide. This is where I would like to spend a bulk of the conversation, because in many of our presentations, what happens is we will give the regular ACEs presentation. We'll go over adversity, we'll go over the brain development, but what it really comes down to is how do we have the conversation about other things that aren't listed in those 10 factors, right? And so it is practice that we do not utilize the ACEs, what has been called a survey, but that's not the way that it was directed. We don't use that as a screening tool. We don't use that as a mechanism to track our clients that we are serving. However, that still happens in the field. And when I go out and I do have the conversation back and forth, like, well, we use this. I'm like, well, there are a lot of reasons why we shouldn't, right? Like, for example, I myself, I have an ACE score of 7. Really, sometimes I think 8, it depends on what's happening. But even if you shook all of the 10 points up, laid them out, just pick 7, right? They're all terrible experiences that occur. Considering all of those things, what we can see here on the slide is that the roots are things that, and it actually says atrocious cultural experiences. Considering the cultural experiences here listed, we have examples of segregation, family separation, we have slavery, right? There are just so many atrocities that have occurred within our society to our people. And this is kind of where I want to continue to open up a more of a dialogue in our conversation. What are some of the challenges that you all are running into when it comes to cultural and historical trauma that may be leading to behaviors, that may be leading to some disconnect within your organizations? I feel as though this is where the meat of it comes from, and this is not a talking at you time, right? As I present this information and we look at this slide, and this is where we will park for a great remainder of our time together, it's really about considering how those 10 branches that go up, but there's also the climate of what's happening in our world. I can only imagine the studies that will be done for us. Again, I did mention earlier, as we sit here safe, and I want to use that with very heavy air quotations, safe in our country, as we know that children are being displaced for their homes and being put into other countries, as fathers have been separated, it's an entire country of fathers, uncles, grandfathers, brothers, and cousins have been displaced in their country. How the climate, right? When we think about adversity, I believe now that all of us, or any child or anyone that has survived COVID-19, can add this war, right? And just the unsettling nature of our world right now as an adverse childhood experience, and how we will be able to look at those things going forward. This tree is really a discussion point. And when in Jessica's presentation, I know that she went over it, and when we even discussed putting that into the packet for adversity, I really can't talk about understanding adverse childhood experiences without talking about trauma. And that was one of the conversations that we had. As a person of color, I believe that there was a little bit of more credence given often when I would go into a community speaking about adversity and how we are dealing with not just the Black and white binary when it comes, because we have to consider that trauma for children is not whether, oh, you're a Black child, so you're going to experience this trauma against the white people that may be enforcing it. There's so much more to that. And I'm not saying that in a way saying that white people have done things to Black people. What I'm saying is that there's more colors there. Here we go. So Black, Indigenous people of color experience, when we consider these things, it's more than just, there's so many other colors that are represented there. When I think about my friends that are just classified as Asian and what they're going through now in our country specifically, any experience is hard, no matter what color you are. Black, white, right, Indigenous, just being a person of color, we come with our own experiences overall. But I do want to bring some highlights to really understanding that this is not a conversation that just goes and it stops, right? As we consider adversity for children that they are experiencing, I want to look at some of those factors in the clouds. Okay, so when it comes to droughts, we have up there climate change, right? I have so many young people now that are really concerned about climate change and how their grandchildren will be impacted by what we are now doing to the earth. I remember when there used to be winter, like long winters. Living in the Indianapolis area, I would long to go to Indianapolis when I growing up in Gary, because we had the lake effect, right? So when we got snow, it was a lot of snow and it was really cold. And even now going back home, I go and visit Chicago often, and it's just a different type of experience, right? But when we think about weather, when we think about the changes, I was speaking to someone the other day about the adverse childhood experience study, and they said, well, a lot of this could be curbed. The children would just play outside. And I said, I played outside, but I still had a lot of adversity. So as we think about things that can combat and think about things that are going, that can go one way or another when it comes to this adversity, there's plenty of opportunity there to make sure that we can have all of the resources involved for our children, so that these adversities are being avoided. This one should also look familiar. So when it comes to early death, that is at the top of the ACEs pyramid, or when it comes to generational embodiment, all the things in between. Now, this was adapted from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as we consider what our needs are for really building a community that will be trauma informed and also free from re-traumatization of our population. Okay, so Complex trauma and the adverse childhood experiences that you all went through with Jessica, they're above the Black line. Considering complex trauma, considering adversity, the complexity of trauma comes in so many forms. When we think about the effect of trauma, if we think about the experience of trauma, and then also the lasting, the lasting impending energy that trauma brings to a society. As we move up to those things where we are neurologically disturbed, and those neurological disturbances start to have impending trauma upon our bodies. And so therefore, we're not able to move forward in the way that we would neurologically if we were neurotypical, because of the trauma that we experience. When it comes to coping, and when we are dealing with coping, this is where we will come back and park after we continue to progress up this pyramid, because the coping is really where the conversation lies. This is usually where we find our niche. This is usually where we find our families that need the most help. This is usually where we find our opportunities for the most susceptible to re-traumatization in this area. And so also looking at the burden of disease, distress, criminalization, stigmatization, and then early death, as we talked about that. So let us continue to consider and go back down to the complex trauma of ACEs, adversity, the complex trauma of historical trauma, dealing with those racial issues that may come up. One of the things that I can say, and I don't want to assume that everyone on the call is from Northwest Indiana, because this is a Northwest Indiana forum, even though you probably are. One of the things that I appreciate about my experience in growing up, and again, this is just my personal experience, but I lend that to a lot of my training and my experiences throughout, is really what has happened, what my experience was growing up in Northwest Indiana. Northwest Indiana was the greatest display of segregation that I could really demonstrate by example of Lake County. I grew up in North Lake County, and then there was South Lake County, So considering those things, North Lake County and South Lake County, there were certain rules of engagement that you went on in North Lake County and South Lake County. And even when I speak with some of my friends now, it's like the racism in North Lake County versus South Lake County was so different from racism or other things that we experience in other places. And so thinking about North Lake County, South Lake County, and my personal experience when it comes to the complexity of trauma, just utilizing that to consider some of the steps that we can take, It's more of a look and examination of what's going on in your organization and what's going on in your community right now, That is something that, again, as we park on this slide, we parked on a few slides. We parked on the slide where we had the display of trauma, and that was historical trauma, That was a view of many different icky things that went on to people. Those children have some ACEs, No matter what they are, they're all experiences that we don't want children to have to engage in. And then considering moving forward, we parked a little bit on the tree where we had all types of examples of adversity. At the bottom with the root system there, which is also being demonstrated here on this triangle. Considering the complexity of trauma, as we look at that generational embodiment for historical trauma, we continue to examine how can we make a difference in our communities. So I would like to transition to that conversation. And so the generational embodiment of trauma really can't be overlooked, because simply how our stress response system works. I mentioned the 3 E's of trauma earlier when I talked about the events, the experiences, and then the lasting effects of trauma that occur within our individuals. As we consider whether these traumas are acute, chronic, or complex, the generational embodiment of that historical trauma has everything to do and is exacerbated by microaggressions, by implicit bias, by epigenetics. So when we consider all of those embodiments of the historical trauma, epigenetics, microaggressions, there is no way that we can get around understanding that people are affected by these things. The race issues, the race conditions, and also the local context is where I was taking our conversation to say more about what's really going on in your organization when it comes to race. Earlier, I said, I'm going to take us to the last slide, right? And my anecdote is, let's just be kind. If we started today being kind to each other and treated each other in kindness and treated each other in cultural respect, understanding that we all had different backgrounds, I think that we really could turn this around. Moving back up to the coping now, that coping layer. So I want to read Julie's question. Can you say more about the coping layer? What does that look like? Is it about things that people do to cope with their trauma that end up contributing to future harm, to further harm? Absolutely. And Julie, I believe that this is where, in the community context, this is where we usually come into the picture, because our medical fields are not connected with our behavioral health, right? When it comes to, or our social services, when it comes to looking at an individual holistically. It's really my belief that when it comes to the coping part, this is where we find people. And sometimes they're coping in a way that does contribute more to harming them. And when it comes to us systemically, because this lens and this presentation is focusing on the historical trauma and how that lends to coping. If we think about some of the institutional things that we've done to populations, for example, we know that there is a disproportionality when it comes to Black males that are in prison, right? But that goes back to previous administrations that put laws in that were definitely encouraging bias, right? Microaggressions. I don't even want to say that they were micro at that point, because there are whole communities of fathers and generations in jail that were in there. No, let's not even talk about the 13th Amendment, even though we should talk about the 13th Amendment, where it made it possible for jail to be another form of slavery. And there were communities that were that Black communities specifically that were influenced by those legislative decisions that did not do well. Julie, to your point, I do believe that in the coping stage, it can further exacerbate their trauma. Absolutely. But this is, again, where when we know what's happening in our communities, when we know and we have an idea of how we can help our families cope, we can go forward to make sure that our programming, to make sure that our policies, which I know Julie is doing, to make sure that that's happening. But when it comes to coping, what I have seen in practice is that this is where we have the most ability to impact with relationship and go forward with families so that they can make different decisions in line with what they need to do better. Okay, and so the next question is, what are some of the equitable and justice focused ways to intervene at that point? Look at this. Of course, you're going to have these great conversations. One, on the basis, I really feel, starting with our youth, when it comes to young people, to be equitable, I believe that we should have their voice. I truly believe that there should be nothing about a population without the population. So when we think about the equitable and justice focused ways to intervene at that point, let's look and have conversations about what's going on. This is where our experts are really going to be able to meet with the current need, right? If we think about considering how all of these opportunities are coming up, we always feel like we are definitely swimming upstream. But if we have those conversations with the population at their coping stage, how are you coping? Well, we can go into populations, we can go into communities, and we can see what's happening, right? Are our young people vaping? Why do they think this is cool? Are our young people using drugs or sex or other things to cope with their trauma, to cope with what's going on? Are there community organizations that are available and readily accessible for our families to know that they're there? I can say that in many communities, I love that I have a plethora of resources, right? If I want to send somebody up to Tara up at, but she used to be a teen school, I don't know if she's there anymore, right? If I know that what Julie's doing at the villages, if I need to refer someone there, or if I meet a great youth worker, I'm like, you know what, you would be really good because I've done that. So you need to reach out to this organization and work for them. They're looking for others. So I believe that when we start with the equitable practices, we look at the community and we see what is going on. What are the undesirable behaviors and coping mechanisms that are being utilized in that way, and how do we progress with them forward? I think that that's a great opportunity to be able to do that, and I hope that I answered that. So I do want to go up and read some more. All right, so please address your perspective on how foster care does or does not re-traumatize kids when the court system continues visits with bio parents and foster kids when those bio parents do not participate in services. Frequently, this causes harm, which eventually impacts the child's ability to be adopted or move forward permanency in the future. Please address this concern. You know, this sounds like a very personal concern of yours too, and it is one of mine. I believe that there is no right way to break up a family, right? And even to try. I have seen, I'm going to say this, and this is a very on the fence response, and I do apologize, anonymous attendee, but I have seen children that have been put in foster care, placed in foster care and adopted with parents that were absolutely trying. But because of some systemic things, because of some life choices, because of those things, they were truly trying and all that they can do. But the system kind of took over at that point, and 15 out of 22 months was just not enough for them to get it together. I do want to say that, anonymous attendee, I absolutely agree that there is opportunity for re-traumatization in the system. I believe that our policies are in place to keep people safe, but I also believe that policies often trump the human experience. And I know that my friend Sandy Runkle, when she saw me a few months ago, did not ask for me to come and just tell all of my personal story and give my personal opinion. But what I have seen, I've seen both sides. I've seen policy work in the favor. I've also seen it really hurt some people. So what I think that if we can look at things with some policy parameters, right? With some policy parameters, but also think about the individual instance, because it sounds like the children in care or the children that you are caring for or about have had some difficulties, and it really may be re-traumatizing them. And I'm going to say that I have had children when back in the day, I didn't really give a big overview of what I've done, but I was a case manager at DCS, right? And so when I was there, I can say that I know that we removed children from some homes only to put them in homes that were not a better situation. And I'm saying that wholeheartedly to say that I believe that there is an opportunity to look at our systems. But go back and ask my friend, Julie Whitman, about how hard it is, or what the challenge is, and hard shouldn't be maybe the term that I use, but what the challenge is to get systems change in that way, right? Because it is, yeah, it's an uphill battle. And I laugh to keep from crying in that, because I've been in some situations with that. And so I do apologize if I can't give you a more specific answer, but I can just feel the passion in your question and say that there is no, it's a concern. And I am with you in your fight and your struggle. So anonymous attendee, reach out to me and let me know how we can support you, but I've seen both sides of it. And Pebbles wants to know if I feel that cognitive dissonance that is going on in the world continues to create more trauma. Yes. Let me clap a few times, yes. And do I feel that this exacerbates complex trauma? Let me say, book banning, don't say gay, etc. I believe that people are entitled to believe what they want. But when we try to cut off the opportunity for a full spectrum of life, I believe that is traumatizing in general. I do also believe that we can't just silence things that are actually happening. I believe that people should have the choice to live in the way that they choose. I don't even want to say choose, right? Because I personally don't believe it's a choice. But when I speak with my families that are of same sex and their children are being bullied in school because now they're being erased from their families, what does that say? I can also say that I learned the most about being in family and being in relationship when it came to interacting with my kids in foster care. I grew up with play cousins, and I can say that the definition of family is ever expanding, and it is what it is to me. And this is me personally, but Pebbles, to your point, I do feel as though it exacerbates complex trauma because of the complexity, right? Complex trauma occurs in relationships. When we think about trauma on many different levels, I talked about the 3 E's briefly: affects, the experience, and the event itself. The complexities of trauma get exacerbated when our government intervenes. So I do agree, Pebbles. I know that Northwest Indiana is a bit conservative, a bit less conservative than other areas of our state. But when it comes to those things and just allowing people not to be exposed to things, I think there's a danger in that as well. We can't erase history, right? Which is why I said when Dr. Tishner and I first started this conversation, we wanted pictures like we put in the first slides. It made some people uneasy, but I need to lean into that uneasiness so that we can have the conversations, because these things are happening. All right. Do you have a thought on the mental health stigmatization in communities? I do, and I always will. Let me see. I feel that assistance to address trauma is important, but how do we address mental health assistance is positive? I believe that we just start normalizing it. I can say that, and Ann, you're a Journey Fellow, but I can say that in most of the conversations now that I'm having with youth workers, it is all about what is happening in their personal lives. I have never been in such more of a loving environment. And I say loving because I just think that we're all sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. That is my outlook on life. But I do believe that more people are more apt to say, you know, hey, my therapist said we should do this, or, you know, I shouldn't do that. My therapist has agreed to, has said I shouldn't. Now that's in my world. I live in a world of people like Sandy Runkles, Julie Whitmans, and Julie Villarreal's, right? So for me, it's a little bit different because I'm surrounded by that. As far as culturally, I think that we need to create a community of healing, so that our people know that it's okay to reach out, right? It's okay to have resources. So I think that the stigmatization of mental health in communities is exacerbated by a lot of things. I think that I don't know what type of champions we will need to go forward, but there are a few, right, to do that. But I think that we've had the stigmatization. Our goal now is just to normalize things. But to Pebble's point, how do we normalize something when we're trying to silence it, right? If we still have bills going forward that say that our families, no matter what you believe, no matter what your religion tells you to say, no matter how you go about it, if we can say that this is not a family, but this is, what are we, right? There's stigmatization everywhere. So Ann, I hope that I was able to give that some fidelity. If not, just holler back at me in the chat. I'm sorry, Q&A, and then we'll go from there. Julie says that you're right, that policy should establish parameters, but individuals need to use judgment and compassion to understand each individual situation. Thank you, Julie, for agreeing with me on that. I am always going to tend towards the human side of us, right? So as we consider this in the view of historical trauma, what we are looking at, all the questions have been things that have happened in the past have led us to where we are right now, right? Looking at this tree, those branches there, all of those 10 instances that come out from the ACE study that are the only 10 instances that are there. What about the other traumas, right? That's how we have the weather on top. That's how we have the root system on the bottom. But there's so many other things that we can put into place. These are all things that have historically happened. And I feel as though we have overlooked the human being. We absolutely need to have laws. We absolutely need to have accountability. Often when I'm teaching about trauma-informed care, they say, oh, well, you know, you're just being too soft, or we're letting people get in the way. I'm like, no, we have to have an understanding. We have to have an understanding. Like, who is the one that is going to go and hug Putin at this point? Will it be the same people that hunted down Osama bin Laden, right? Or the monster of my generation was Saddam Hussein. When we think about things like this that happen, how are we looking at this? How do we take the human aspect? And please understand that I am not sympathizing with the murder of children and bombing of countries. What I'm saying is I'm using this as a specific example of what's happening right now. How do we deal with these things? And how do we continue to teach our children that, yes, these bad things have happened to you, but we need to move forward. We need to move forward with the understanding that we can be resilient. We need to move forward with the understanding that these policies may be in place, but they may not fit what's really happening for the human experience. I am always going to be the champion for the human experience. And unfortunately, our policies don't really lend to that. Okay, so let's see what the next one is. I have a question about the unofficial foster mom that had an autistic child. Okay, let me say that it looks like there's a lot going on in this story, and I don't have many details to be able, again, this will be anecdotal, but let me say that we want to make sure that we can ensure that children are that are not re-traumatized by understanding what that trauma could be. I can say that I hope that I haven't traumatized my children, but they've been traumatized, right? I've done things to them, or I may have put them in a situation understanding that the knowledge that I had was the best that I had. And I'm taking responsibility for that and accountability and saying for my own personal children. But when it comes to these specific situations like this, I think that unfortunately, surround yourself with people, because it says something about an unofficial foster mom. And again, I don't have enough information. Surround yourself with people in the agencies that can impact what's going on. And then also advocate for yourself. We never want to put a child in a situation where they are going to be traumatized, where they are going to be in a situation where there's harm or hurt or danger. But we also want to consider what's happening in parameters. And unfortunately for your situation, I just don't have enough information to know what that is. So I want to make sure I answer the second part. I feel that assistance to address trauma is important, but how do we address mental health assistance is positive. Yeah, I think that we talked about this, but this is something that I can actually go on forever and talk about, because I believe that mental wellness is cool. In fact, I am working right now on a project with the Department of Education on a project called youth worker well-being. And what we have done is we have taken the 8 dimensions of wellness by SAMHSA, and we are creating a field guide. During COVID, there were so many instances of youth workers just not doing well. And so my friends over at IYSA, that's the Indiana Youth Services Association, they house many programs, including the Indiana Victims Trafficking Assistance Program, The Journey, which is for renewal in youth work. They also house Safe Place. They also house the Youth Service Bureaus. What else is there? Making Good Decisions, which is the Alcohol Prevention and Awareness Program. So many other programs. Having such a network of youth work programs in our state, they were commissioned to really do something more. Lily gave out what I think was $100 million, maybe Julie would know, $100 million for organizations to assist organizations, youth serving organizations during COVID. And most of that money and the funds, when asked about what was happening with it from the intermediaries, and the intermediaries are those organizations that don't work directly with the youth, but they provide youth services, right? It was paying rent. It was making sure that they can make payroll. There were a lot of things, but wellness was something that just wasn't being addressed and giving the attention that it really needed. When it comes to stigmatization of mental health, I believe that years of not understanding, and I am not a medical, right? I'm not a medical doctor. I'm working on my doctorate, but it won't be in the medical field. But I do know that there is a disconnect between healthcare and let me just say healthcare. There's a disconnect, because I believe that my mental health is just as important as my physical health. In fact, they are correlative. And so considering those things, and I think that as we look more at the mind-body integration, it is my hope that we will be able to combine those fields at some point and look at people holistically. I also know that there has been a shift. I believe in the healing energies and non-traditional medicine, as well as westernized medicine. But there has been a shift where I'm having more engagements for sound baths, which can be a healing mechanism and things of that nature. I believe that as we open up the conversation to be more inclusive of modalities that help people heal, modalities that help bring people to happiness and laughter. Laughter is a great tool for healing. Not the only tool for healing. There is medicine needed as well. But I believe that we can start to combat that stigmatization. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I can talk about that forever. Julie has made a comment that it's hard for traumatized adults to help traumatized children. We need support. We need to support the adults who are working and raising children. That is what my whole organization is about. And I've already put it in there. Julie is sharing my heart in this, right? This is why I work for youth workers. This is why when I need to probably tell the story about my time for those of you who don't know, I used to work for, I've said it, Department of Child Services, but I work for the youth workers to make sure that we can support the adults and families who are working with children, right? Raising children is hard. I am a mother of 5. Sandy did mention that in there, but it's hard. right? It's hard. It doesn't get easier. And then we put them in the world where they're with hard people who have come from hard places, and it just gets hard. I totally agree with that. It is a challenge, and there is an opportunity when someone who is traumatized is raising a child. In a perfect world, we would all have events that were pleasant experiences, so the lasting effect would be wonderful. However, to the focus of this discussion and why we have come on, it is really pertinent to have this conversation about adversity and how we look at it historically. I truly believe that as we go through and consider historical trauma, we ourselves as organizations have to make the changes, and we have to continue to advocate for the services for the families that we actually serve, not the ideal family. Not the ideal family. Our ideal families are what policies are made for. So considering that, how many of you serve ideal families, right? We serve families that are in some type of transition. And I can say that I know that with my friends that are on here, you all have had some family things that have occurred in life in general, and we just go through them and we support each other and we work it out. This is a hard conversation usually to have. And when I'm presenting with Dr. Tishner, with again, who has this conversation, his perspective as well is, we like to hint to, Julie, I think you're reading my mind. Because Julie says that the ideal family in the policy mind is also white. So we have a lot of unspoken assumptions about placing kids with families that are better, right, than their own family. Yes. And so this is exactly where I was going in the conversation as we talk about what's happening with adversity, with adverse childhood experiences. We have to consider the historical lens. And let me say that as a person of color, I don't necessarily have a view where, and I have some opinions. I believe that it's important for children to see themselves represented. I'm not saying like as far as when it comes to placing a child somewhere like, oh, don't do this family because they're Black and they should be with a Black family. What I'm saying, I'm not saying that they should be with a Black family because they're Black. What I'm saying is that we should have opportunities for our children to see people that look like them. That exposure and representation really does matter. However, all of my families that I have worked with, I'm not looking at it in a way where I'm saying this isn't right because of color mixture. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that we need to make sure that a child's re-traumatization and trauma is actually being served and is actually being okay. Okay, how can I help my young adult son who experienced sexual and physical abuse with his biological family? Yeah, that's hard. He has therapy and he does not, and it doesn't seem to be enough. Let me see. He experienced his trauma throughout his childhood until he reached my home. Yeah. So you have a journey of healing to be on him with. And when you say help, I know it's everything, giving him the love. If I can just read into what you displayed there, I'm going to assume that he went one way or the other. He is either actually very recluse, right, and doesn't want to be bothered with anyone at all, or he has all of the attention because he has all of the behaviors, right, that would include everything from aggression, acting out, right, or yeah, and everything in between. I am sorry for children that I am sorry that we have to be put in a situation where we have to heal children, help children heal that have been put in situations where they should never been, right? Physical and sexual abuse is enough. And then we're talking about other life things that happen, right? Look at the branches on our tree. Look at the branches on those trees to consider all the other things and all the other possibilities. Physical and sexual abuse is enough. And it's so hard, and it's not fair. So Sandra, when you say help, there's so many possibilities there. I think you surround him with people that love him, and listen, right? One of the things that I learned in my time in youth work is that we have two ears, right? And there's a better way that's said, and there's even some Bible verses that say it. And he's overeating too. Yeah, so he's eating those emotions. But it's to listen more, find out what he needs. I don't know how old he is or at what level he's able to express himself, but listening and you having the patience of all those things that would give you patience would be great for you. So, and I know it would be great if I can just say, hey, you just need to do this and all of those world's problems will go away. I wish that I could do this, right? Just a magic, like sprinkle some fairy dust on it, and then all of these branches would go away. This historical trauma conversation really is an open conversation. So I do appreciate the flexibility of the host allowing me to open up Q&A a little bit sooner. Okay, so possible question from my new friend, Mr. Hug. What people, places, activities, and connections in your early life help you to be resilient? That's a great question. Let me go back and give a little bit of story time. And I'm going to come back to you, Sarah, to talk about that. So let me actually, I can tie these two questions together because Sarah asked about how do we break generational curses and trauma. And so let me start by saying that I am, I'm always in awe of how far I've come. And in fact, I'm getting kind of emotional right now because I'm on this very human Zoom with people that I looked up to as a young case manager. And when I think about people like Twan, and we were case managers together, now, you know, the director of the Indiana Department of Child Services, that's a lot of just growing and just being wonderful and all those things together. So I really appreciate this question because what people, places, activities, connections, et cetera, in your early life helped you to be resilient. I think that we've gone through a lot of the questions. I can give a bit more background. So I can talk about historical trauma because it had always been a part of my story because I never really understood how certain people groups can be mistreated in ways that others weren't. And so that is something, even as a child, I was passionate about helping people. I am in awe of the good friends I have now because my passion has always been helping people. And I surround myself with people who serve youth workers now. That is my life, and that is my life's work at this point. And so when I was a child, I grew up in a home that was very chaotic. And we went to church and we went to school and there was chaos. And that is what I remember. My best friend right now is my brother. And I can tell you, there are many times that you probably would have saw me chasing him down Fifth Avenue. I lived like down by the viaduct where 65 ends and begins. I didn't want to be with him when we were growing up, but now he is my best friend. And I always realized just the shared childhood trauma that we had helps that, right? Beyond the fact that he's my brother, we have some stories of just some things we went through because of my mother's undiagnosed mental health issues. And so I can say that understanding the makeup of my grandmother, who was I was physically abused by my grandmother. And so just generational curses, generational trauma that were passed down from her, trauma that I heard that she experienced when she was a child, trauma that was passed on to my mother and then my brother and I. And so I had different ways of coping, right, Julie? So we talk about that coping and coming in. I was the child that I did really well in school. I exceeded in school. I was always like teacher's pet. In fact, I would see some of my teachers when would get older, and they'd be like, you know, you were always like kind of like almost like a peer. You were always so mature. I wasn't. I just had to be ahead of where I was developmentally ahead because I was going through so much at home. Because of my mother's mental health issues, me and my brother rarely went to school. We rarely went to school. So I knew about online school way before. This was in the 90s. I'm like, I was doing homework at home forever, but I was always on the honor roll because that was where I excelled because there were so many things in my life that I couldn't control. I became pregnant when I was 15 years old. I had my first daughter. And then I had another child when I was 18. Both of these children I had in high school. And along the way, I would reach out for opportunities. So when it comes to those people and resources and connections that were in my life, for me, it was school. When I became pregnant, I stopped participating in the sporting activities, which was really swimming. But I was class vice president. I was in French club, Red Ribbon Club, all of those things that could take me away from focusing on what I had to deal with. And I went home were my connections, which is why I am not surprised that I'm a youth worker, because I believe in opening up those opportunities, opening up those doorways, because childhood adversity, again, I have a 7, right? Mix up the branches, just pick 7. They're all terrible. And so considering all of those things, considering all those connections, I need to also say that resilience is not something that you're born with. You build resilience. And we've talked about some of those things when it comes to institutionalization, when it comes to recognizing people's histories, when it comes to all of those wonderful things that make us who we are. Resilience is not something that I would go back and say, I cannot wait to grow up and be resilient, right? But I am. And so many of our families are. And these names that I can go through the list, which is why I'm getting emotional, we all are. We know what we've been through. We know where we've been. So considering those things, early life, where even in the research from Harvard, it tells us that the quicker that we can help to build resilience, the quicker that we can have positive outcomes versus those negative outcomes, the quicker that we can make that scale way down, the better. So long story short, I am a mother of 5. I kind of told you about that. I had 2 when I was in high school. I went to Purdue Cal. I went to IU. I did both of those. I double majored. I graduated. I have a master's degree, working on a doctorate, right? All those great things. In between, there were youth workers there for me. In between, there were case managers there for me. When I started my time at the Indiana Department of Child Services, I realized how blessed I was that we were never in foster care. But I also need to say that there were many days that I wish someone would have taken me from my mother's home. Many days, right? But now knowing that it's kind of like you're shooting the dice what type of home you'll end up in, I made it and I survived and I was resilient. I really appreciate that question, but also to talk about those generational curses and how we break them, we stop re-traumatizing and we start to call out the need for mental health services. We start to step in. One of the things that I loved about being at DCS is that the community that we built. Lake County, I've been to all 92 counties in our state through my work. Lake County was a family. I can absolutely say that. I met Julie. I met everyone that has me coming here to speak. Lake County was a family. So even though I talked about that racial divide of South Lake County and North Lake County, I can say that my Lake County roots, even my good friend Nancy Fisher, who went on to do great things at White's Residential and then and Children's Bureau. She's now in her private practice. We all came from Lake County. Considering those things and generational curses, and that was the question that I was leading to bridge from Mr. Hug's question, is that we have to have the right people in the right place for the right person. And if it's not you, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, if it's not you, find the right one for that family. Looking at this through the lens of historical trauma, there are some terrible, atrocious things that have happened. Yes, they're represented by the roots on this slide right here. But when it comes to how we combat those things, we make it a sunny day. And I'm going to read into, I see that this is a quick question, so I'm gonna have to read a little bit into Misty's. Why can't we move the emphasis from building resilience to removing, reducing trauma? I agree with that, right? And let me tell you that early in the days, I remember years and years ago, this was probably circa 2014, around that time, Nick over at Gymnast had me come and speak to the community. I did a community presentation over there, and we were talking about preventing child abuse. And I said, why don't we just focus on child wellness, right? Why don't we focus on thriving children? Y'all, this is where I get excited. I'm starting to get like perspiring, right, Julie? I know that we can do it. Why can't we focus on the positive? Why can't we do those things? Why do we have to prevent child abuse, or we just can't make sure that our young people are doing well? Let me get to this last question. When I hear the term resilient children, it often saddens me because I get the sense that they had to live through so much at a young age, right? I agree. I'm going to read Misty's question, and then I think we're going to take some more, make sure that we are on track. One of my 13-year-olds who has been in care for just under a year is increasing behaviors as he believes he may be going home. Yep, because he knows what home is like. So he is starting to he's self-sabotaging because he doesn't want to go back there. He is conflicted. Yep. He's conflicted on how he feels as he is currently in the most stable, safe, and predictable place he has ever been. I know, Missy, I'm with you here. He is starting to fight at school, lie, run away. He is starting to talk more about what happened at home. all the domestic violence he witnessed, sexual abuse that was covered up, constant homelessness, parental drugs. He was excited about his future, but now talks about his future not mattering because all the things will never change and he would just be back in foster care. How would you suggest I encourage his outlook and resiliency? And this is to the point of the question that I spoke to earlier. I need to give a little bit of history. So I worked at DCS. We've heard that a few times now, right? I worked at DCS. When I worked at DCS, I was the lead on the program Collaborative Care. I started as a case manager in the ongoing field, and then I switched over to assessment, and then I went to central office and I became the independent living specialist for our region. But at some point, someone was pregnant and we played musical counties, and so I was all over the place. I was the lead on the program Collaborative Care, and we wrote that 6-month rule where you couldn't have contact with families will be done because children need consistent caring adults in their life. Misty, I don't know what the policy is now because so many things have changed, so many moons and so many administrations. You have to find something that he has hope in, even if it's as simple as anime. As long as there's anime around, you will be like, we can hold on to that. We can create, we can have hope. You have to find the hope that he has now, because the reality is, and again, this is where I was saying, I was speaking to that question earlier, where I had to be very on the fence because there's so many things involved where we can't look at his individual circumstance and say, hey, it looks like you're going back home because they're on track. But we probably know at 13 years old, if he comes back in the system, he's going to be an older child in the system, and that just makes it that much more difficult for him. These situations of despair for our children when they don't know how to have a great outlook of the future are troubling and hard. And I can say that, and let me share that, even though my conversations, because again, Julie is my personal friend, we have teenage daughters, and it's hard. You have to help him find the hope, and then we will help him find the hope. And that's probably the greatest thing. Missy, reach out to me. You know, you have my contact information. And I wish you the best in that. And I wish him the best in that, and being able to find some resources that will be long lasting and sustainable for him. Working with pregnant teens, many of whom are young, women of color, what would you suggest is a proper way to acknowledge and address concerns about racial disparities and infant and maternal health and mortality rates? I'm actually working with one of my friends, Marika. She's over at the Indiana Department of Health. We're trying to address some of these issues. I apologize, this is not relevant to the conversation. I'm sorry, I'm a teen parent. I was a teen parent. It was very relevant to me, but I felt that it may be some of these young women with youth, minors, some are in foster care, right? Let me try to get to increasing the likelihood of childhood adversity. Let me say yes, yes, and yes, and yes. I have two schools of children, right? I had my children when I was a young person trying to grow up with my kids. And then I have my children where I knew about trauma, where I was educated, and their life is different, right? Let me just say it like that. When you have a teen parent, they're still growing up, right? We were still growing up. I think that the best way to combat that is get them linked with someone also that can help them see the hope for their futures and also help them with their babies. Because it is a problem. Everything that you said is right, Ashley. Everything that you said is right. But we can put some preventative factors in place to make sure that these children and their parents can live and thrive. So let me say that I have 1 minute left. Moderators, let me say, Julie and Sandy, you know me well enough to know that when I present is more, I get the energy from the group. So I appreciate the flexibility that you all have allowed. Eric, thank you for driving for me. Mr. Hug, it was great to meet you. And Rachel, thank you also for keeping me on track. I appreciate all of those things. And I am okay to share my contact information. And yes, they have my slides so that you all can get them and we can go forward and have great conversations. And walking away, let me say that things happened. They were not great. Right now is the opportunity that we have. And through this conversation, I was able to just really address some things that happen and how we look at them through adversity. But now our charge is to look at specifically what's going on in your community and talk with those that are experts, but also partner with those that are actually going through it so that we can have hands that can hold our communities and make them better, right? Because there's always potential for progress. Let's not go backwards. That's it. Thank you. It's been great and wonderful. I'm so happy to see so many friends, and I'm going to stop talking now so that I don't get clicked off.